Welcome to this episode of History Addict podcast, where we bring history to life through the voices of those who were there. Today we delve into the harrowing experiences of William Oliver Taylor, one of the few survivors of the infamous Battle of Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand. In this first-hand account, you'll hear about the bravery, the mistakes, and the tragic outcome of a day that changed American history forever. William Oliver Taylor, born in 1853, enlisted in the U.S. Army, seeking adventure and a sense of purpose. By 1876, he found himself serving as a private in Company A of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, under the command of General George Armstrong Custer. Although my role may not have been high-ranking, I would soon find myself part of one of the most infamous events in U.S. military history, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Through sheer fortune, I am remembered as one of the few survivors of this ill-fated battle, where the 7th Cavalry faced a devastating defeat at the hands of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. Somehow, I managed to escape that deadly battleground, making my way back to the river, where I was eventually rescued by the steamer Far West. My account, written later in 1876, has since become a crucial source for historians, providing detailed insight into what transpired during Custer's last stand. On the morning of June 24, 1876, we set out on a grueling march. We frequently paused as the scouts ahead carefully surveyed the valley. After hours of marching, we finally halted to rest and give our horses food and water. Our rations were simple, just some coffee and hardtack, but it was enough to get us through the day. Afterward, we laid out our blankets and set up our shelter tents on the ground, eager for the little rest we could get. The location of our camp was one of the most beautiful places I had seen during my time in the cavalry. To our right stood a high bluff with a cool, clear brook flowing between the bluff and the river. The land stretched out in a flat, grassy plateau about 200 yards wide, dotted with wild rose bushes in full bloom and the occasional tree, giving it the appearance of a park. I remember thinking that this peaceful place did not seem like the kind of setting where men would soon meet their end in battle. It was clear why the river had been named as it was, lined with low willows and those fragrant rose bushes. It was a spot Custer, who often chose campsites for their natural beauty, would have favored. In a bitter twist of fate, it seemed all too fitting that this beautiful spot would become the last camp for so many of my fellow soldiers. I've often wished since then that this place could be found and photographed, as it remains vivid in my memory. That evening, my company was positioned near Custer's headquarters, where the general sat alone in his tent for a long time, seemingly lost in deep thought. I was lying on my side, watching him. The dusk was gathering, and it seemed to me that his face carried an expression of sadness I hadn't noticed before. Perhaps his thoughts were far away, lingering on Fort Lincoln and his wife, Libby, whom he had left behind. Or maybe his heart was heavy with a sense of foreboding about what was to come. Custer's leadership had always been both admired and criticized. Known for his bravery and aggressive tactics, he was often seen as a daring, if reckless, commander. On the morning of the fateful battle, Custer made the controversial decision to divide his forces into smaller battalions, believing that a swift, decisive attack would break the strength of the Native American forces. However, this decision would soon prove disastrous, as he and his men were outnumbered and overwhelmed. Many, including myself, wondered if Custer had underestimated the strength and coordination of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. The general's strategic miscalculations and failure to wait for reinforcements contributed significantly to the shocking defeat that would forever be remembered as Custer's last stand. Whatever was weighing on Custer's mind that night, his reverie was soon interrupted by the arrival of several officers who had come for further instructions. After the council broke up, a group of younger officers gathered near one of the bivouacs. Soon, the mournful words of Annie Laurie filled the air. The slow, solemn cadence of the song struck me as unusual for cavalrymen, especially while we were on an Indian trail. Following Annie Laurie, they sang the doxology, a prayer asking for blessings from God. I couldn't help but wonder if these men, many of them recent graduates of West Point, were unconsciously sensing the tragic fate that awaited them. As the last words of the hymn faded, they seemed to shake off their gloomy mood, finishing with a boisterous rendition of "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow." At the time, I thought this transition somewhat irreverent, but then again, religious solemnity has never been the most prominent trait among soldiers. With a few exchanged goodnights, we all lay down for what little rest we could manage. An unusual stillness settled over the camp, broken only by the occasional stamping of a horse or the call of a night bird. As we lay there, surrounded by this scenic, tranquil landscape, it was hard to imagine that just a short distance away, a fierce battle had taken place the previous week when Crazy Horse repelled General Crook's forces. Nor could any of us have predicted that, within a month, the very same native forces we were now pursuing, emboldened by yet another victory, would again be encamped by this very stream, only to be dispersed by General Terry's approach from the north. Little did we know then that our command would circle back to this very spot in pursuit of the same hostile forces. Within a few miles of where we lay, the brave lame deer would soon give his life for the right to hunt and live along this rose-bordered stream. His name, in the years to come, would be enshrined in the memories of his people alongside the tragedies that befell us. Our rest was short-lived. By around 10 p.m., we were roused from our sleep and ordered to saddle up for a night march. Soon enough, we were on horseback again, still following the Rosebud River as we ascended its North Fork, moving over the divide, separating the Rosebud from the Little Bighorn. The march was exhausting, but we pressed on for 10 miles or more, halting only around 2 a.m. We were left waiting for news from the scouts who had gone ahead to locate the Indian camp. With no immediate orders, we removed our saddles and took what little opportunity we had to nap. As the first light of day broke over the horizon, some of the men made coffee, though the water we found was poor and difficult to drink. The men who didn't care to sleep sat around in small groups, quietly discussing the prospects of a fight, their pipes constantly in hand. General Custer, who had gone ahead to a high point on the divide, returned with news that the scouts had spotted smoke rising from an Indian village, along with pony herds grazing in the valley, some 12 to 15 miles away. By a little before 8 a.m., Custer had returned, riding bareback, possibly bareheaded, as he moved from troop to troop, informing the officers that the Indians had been located and that we would move out immediately. The men quickly began saddling up, and soon we were in motion again, ascending the divide between the Rosebud and Little Bighorn rivers. We pressed on until about 10:30 a.m. when we came to a halt in a ravine about 4 or 5 miles from the summit of the divide. We were ordered to stay concealed and remain quiet. I overheard Captain Godfrey remark that it had been Custer's original plan to delay the attack until the following morning. But when it became clear that our presence had been detected, we had no choice but to act immediately. Shortly after noon, the regiment was divided into battalions. Major Reno was in command of the advance battalion, which included Troop M under Captain French, Troop A under Captain Moylan, and Lieutenant DeRudio, and Troop G under Lieutenants McIntosh and Wallace. We also had 30 Indian scouts, led by Lieutenants Varnum and Hare, along with 2 interpreters, Isaiah Dorman, a man of color, and Frank Gerard, a half-breed. 3 white scouts, Charlie Reynolds, George Herendeen, and a man named Barandot, had joined our ranks, along with 2 medical officers, Dr. DeWolf and Dr. Porter. Though we didn't know the exact size of our battalion, it probably numbered just under 150 men. Meanwhile, Captain Benteen's battalion, consisting of troops D, H, and K, totaling around 125 men, moved off to our left front. General Custer, leading troops C, E, F, J, and L, rode to our right. Captain McDougall, escorting the pack trains, brought up the rear with Troop B. Following the Indian Trail, our battalion marched down a valley where Benteen's, or Sundance Creek, flowed. Although dry at the time, the stream eventually emptied into the Little Bighorn when it held water. As we advanced, we passed by a funeral teepee containing the body of a fallen warrior. Our Indian scouts, in their grim ritual, set it ablaze. Later, we learned that the body was that of Circling Bear's brother, Old She-Bear, who had been killed during the battle against General Crook on the Rosebud, just 8 days prior, on June 17th. Though some of our scouts reported seeing Indians keeping a distance ahead of us, I saw none myself. As we neared the river, Major Reno received an order to quicken the pace. Before long, we arrived at the Little Bighorn, a stream about 50 to 70 feet wide, its waters clear and icy cold. The horses plunged into the river, eager to quench their thirst, and we followed suit. I recall shaping the brim of my hat into a scoop to drink what would be my last drop of water for the next 24 hours. After the horses were watered, we crossed the river and pushed through the brush onto the vast prairie ahead. We dismounted briefly to tighten our saddles, then mounted up and continued moving down the valley. As we rode through the valley, the river wound to our right, flanked by dense woods and steep bluffs. To our left, low foothills began to rise. I remember seeing pony herds scattered across the landscape, along with mounted men moving in all directions, some circling, others riding back and forth, rounding up their ponies and signaling to one another. We advanced cautiously but steadily. Then came the command to trot. Faint puffs of smoke appeared on the horizon, followed by the sharp ping of bullets. The order to charge rang out. Major Reno shouted the command, and some of our men began to cheer in response to the warriors' calls, but Reno quickly silenced them, ordering the noise to stop. Again, the command to charge was given, this time with more urgency. I instinctively turned to look back, just in time to see Major Reno and Lieutenant Hodgson riding just behind our company. Reno raised a bottle to his lips and then passed it to Hodgson. Though the bottle, half full of amber liquid, wasn't unusual, the sight stayed with me. As we readied ourselves for battle, I found myself in a difficult position. I was the fourth man in the count-off, responsible for holding the horses. This role kept me from joining the fight directly, though I had tried to switch places with Cornelius Crowley, the third man. Thankfully, I hadn't succeeded. Crowley was already showing signs of mental distress, and the coming battle would only worsen his condition. He was later placed under close watch by the stable guard. As we moved toward the Indian village, the river continued to wind through the prairie, its banks lined with tall cottonwood trees and thick brush. We rode hard across the rough terrain, our horses carrying us swiftly toward the unknown. Looking down the line, I saw determined faces, some pale, not from fear, but from the closeness of death. The charge was well underway, but as I held the horses, my attention turned toward the front lines. The audacity of our situation became apparent. We, about 150 cavalrymen, were charging headlong into a vast Indian village with at least 2,500 Sioux warriors, and we were doing so on foot. It felt like sheer madness. This wasn't just any engagement. We were attacking an encampment with more than 1,800 lodges. It was, without a doubt, a desperate and dangerous move. As the cavalrymen rushed forward, Lieutenant Hare took the horses I was holding into the woods, just behind the skirmish line for safety. We didn't stay in the skirmish line for long, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. The air was filled with the noise of gunfire and occasional shouts, though I saw little of Major Reno during this time. His voice, issuing commands, was conspicuously absent. Suddenly, everything turned into chaos. The skirmishers started falling back, searching frantically for their horses in the thick brush. I remember seeing the panic in their eyes, and in my own rush, I spotted Cornelius Crowley nearby, anxiously searching for his horse. I called to him, perhaps a bit too sharply, but it snapped him out of his daze. He ran over to me, and I tossed him the bridle of his horse. As I mounted my own, I found myself instinctively following the others, mounting and dismounting twice as the situation deteriorated. We started to move as a unit once again, but it quickly became clear that we were being flanked. To my left, I saw a group of mounted Indians charging through the woods, intent on cutting us off. At first, I thought they were our own scouts, but a second glance made it clear that these were hostile warriors. They wore only breechclouts, with feathers in their hair and muskets in hand. One warrior, in particular, caught my eye. He was a powerful figure, with a magnificent war bonnet of long feathers trailing behind him as he rode. I felt a strong temptation to fire at him, but the dense trees made it difficult, and I knew my poor aim wouldn't help matters. Instead, I focused on escaping. The brush was growing thicker, and my right stirrup caught on a branch, nearly pulling it from the saddle. I had to ride more carefully to keep my balance. It was a struggle to navigate through the dense underbrush, but before long, I emerged from the woods onto the open prairie. What greeted me was a sight I'll never forget. Only 200 yards away, a massive line of Indian warriors was charging toward us at full speed, their ponies thundering across the ground. They were whooping and howling, a terrifying wall of expert riders and fierce fighters, the most formidable warriors I had ever seen. They had outflanked us and were blocking our path back to the river. The warriors closest to us began firing from behind their ponies. I watched as our men made a desperate dash toward the bluffs, which lay half a mile or more away, with the river at their base. The steep banks and thick underbrush along the river made our situation even more dire. Everything seemed to happen in an instant. Just moments earlier, we'd been driving the Indians back, but now we found ourselves scrambling for our lives. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the sudden reversal of fortune. I quickly realized that returning fire was my only option. Every man ahead of me was already firing his revolver at the line of warriors riding parallel to us, and I soon did the same. But the thin red line of the British couldn't compare to the overwhelming number of Sioux warriors bearing down on us. The battlefield quickly became chaotic as hundreds more warriors appeared from the dust, eager to join the fight. Many of us had never fired a shot from horseback before, and we were unprepared for the intensity of the combat. My right stirrup was still loose, making it difficult to aim, but I did my best to shoot at an Indian riding across from me, who seemed to have locked eyes with me. In that moment, I realized the full gravity of my situation. The likelihood of being wounded or captured loomed large in my mind, and I knew exactly what would happen to me if I fell into enemy hands. With this in mind, I made the decision to keep one bullet in my revolver, just in case I needed it for myself. I wasn't going to let them take me alive. But fate had other plans. Our wild flight took us through a prairie dog village, where the holes and mounds made it treacherous to ride at such a frantic pace. My anxiety grew as I worried that my horse might stumble, sending me to the ground, where I would surely be killed. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached an old riverbed, its banks a few feet lower than the surrounding prairie. My horse, with one last effort, leapt down the bank, and I held on tight. As I reached for the pommel of my saddle, still clutching my revolver in my right hand, I lost my grip. The revolver slipped from my hand and disappeared into the tall grass. There was no time to look for it, not with the enemy closing in. I had no choice but to continue on toward the river, where chaos awaited me. The riverbank was filled with struggling men and horses, the water stained with their blood. As I made my way across, I spotted Lieutenant Hodgson among the wounded, his cry of pain still fresh in my ears as he fell. Steering my horse to the right, I managed to avoid the worst of the melee, crossing the river and scrambling up the steep bank on the other side. My horse, Steamboat, was utterly spent by the time we reached the other side. He was a broken-winded horse, destined for condemnation, but due to a shortage of mounts, he had been assigned to me. His wheezing, whistling breaths were the reason for his name, and now, completely exhausted, he refused to go any further. As bullets continued to whistle past me, I gave him a few futile prods with my carbine, but he remained rooted to the spot. At that moment, I realized that I was out of time. Hundreds of Sioux warriors were closing in on us, and I knew that being dismounted meant certain death. With a burst of frustration, I kicked Steamboat one last time, unslung my carbine, and began my climb up the bluff on foot, fully exposed to enemy fire. The ascent up the bluff was steep and treacherous, flanked by deep ravines that ran parallel to the river. It felt as though some divine force had guided us to this narrow path, the only place where we could have climbed so quickly and safely. I had only climbed about a third of the way when I saw my comrade, Myers, better known to us as Tinker Bill, catch up with me. We walked together for a short distance before, with nothing more than a soft, "Oh!" Myers fell forward, dead. He had been shot through the head, between the left ear and the eye. Seeing him fall gave me a chill. I zigzagged the rest of the way up the slope, determined not to be next. Near the top, Frank Neely, an old comrade from M Troop, overtook me on horseback and offered me a ride. I gratefully accepted, mounting his horse, Old Dutch. Although this new horse was no better than Steamboat, I was thankful to be on horseback again. Finally, we reached Reno's command at the top of the bluff, where a few others who had also narrowly escaped had already gathered. It was a miracle that we had made it out alive. The warriors, driven by a desperation to protect their families, seemed like incarnations of fury, but we had survived, for now. As we reached the top of the bluffs, the Indian fire suddenly ceased. It was a relief, though none of us understood why the warriors had abruptly halted their pursuit. Major Reno, now visibly shaken, paced about in a state of agitation. His hat was missing, and he had wrapped a red handkerchief around his head, a strange and unmilitary sight. Exhausted, we lay sprawled on the ground, while the officers exchanged accounts of the battle. Our respite was brief. Captain Benteen soon arrived with his troops, having been dispatched earlier in the day. Benteen's arrival, recorded by Reno at 2:30 p.m., brought with it a much-needed boost to our numbers. Shortly afterward, Captain McDougal arrived with Troop B and the pack train. The sight of the pack train should have been a welcome one, but the nagging question on all our minds remained: where was Custer? For more than 2 hours, we remained on the bluffs, unmolested and unsure of what had happened to Custer's battalion. Our first sergeants took roll calls, tallying the wounded, the dead, and the missing. We could hear distant gunfire in the direction where Custer had gone, but no one seemed willing to make a move. The 3 troops that had been engaged in the valley were shaken, but it wasn't enough to justify the entire command remaining idle. We all knew that Custer couldn't have gone far. The sudden retreat of such a large native force could only mean one thing: another attack on their camp, either real or threatened, from another direction. Later that afternoon, around 4:30 p.m., a small group of 12 comrades appeared, making their way up the bluffs. These men had been dismounted in the woods, or just outside the camp when the retreat began, and had remained hidden until the warriors seemed to move on. Although they had made it safely back to us, 2 men had stayed behind, refusing to risk an escape in daylight. They were later discovered and killed by the Indians. By the time this group rejoined us, we had little time to rest. Soon after, the Indians launched another fierce attack, surrounding our position. We placed the pack train, along with the wounded men and horses, in a low spot between 2 ridges, while the rest of us took positions on the ridges, lying flat to avoid enemy fire. According to Reno's report, the attack began around 6 p.m., though Captain Godfrey later suggested it may have started a bit later. Either way, the Sioux pressed on us fiercely, determined to finish what they had started. That night, long-range fire from the east kept us pinned down. Those holding the horses stayed as flat as they could, praying for the cover of night to bring some relief. It had been a long and dangerous day, and we were all too aware of the narrow escape we had made. Nightfall brought some respite, but the tension in the air remained. Despite the terrifying day we had endured, we were far from safe. The large force of Indians that had overwhelmed Custer's battalion and driven us into retreat hadn't pressed their advantage, and we were left to wonder why. As the hours passed, we remained on edge, waiting for the next attack, wondering what had happened to Custer's men. Captain Benteen, though criticized later for not advancing more quickly with his battalion, showed remarkable bravery that night. His troop was positioned on a ridge to our right, a few hundred yards south. Unfortunately, the men there hadn't dug any defensive pits or created any sort of cover to protect themselves from the anticipated fire, a lapse in judgment for which they paid dearly. At least 10 of his men were wounded, and possibly more, due to their exposed position. Benteen calmly approached Captain Moylan, who was in charge of the defensive line on our ridge, and requested some of the materials we had used for our barricade. It was longer than necessary for the men behind it, so a portion was set aside to help Benteen's troops. I watched in awe as Benteen walked back and forth in full view of the Indians, bullets kicking up dust around him as if completely unconcerned for his own safety. That night, I was part of a group assigned to carry materials over to reinforce Benteen's defenses. A bullet struck the box of hardtack I was carrying, nearly knocking it off my shoulder, but by some miracle, I wasn't hit. I managed to complete the trip and return to my company along a safer route. When I returned to my place behind the barricades, I saw Frank Mann, a citizen packer, raising his head to take a shot. Before I could warn him, a bullet struck him squarely between the eyes. He didn't make a sound. He simply crumpled to the ground, dead in an instant. His recklessness had been his downfall, as he had been firing continuously, exposing himself without much care for cover. An Indian sharpshooter had found his mark. I helped move Mann's body back a few feet, away from the others, as it was too grim a sight to leave him lying between us. I had lost my own revolver earlier in the battle, so I took the one Mann had on him. It was a government-issued weapon, and it would prove invaluable in the fighting that was still to come. The closeness of death that day made life feel all the more precious. Most of us believed that without divine intervention, we were doomed. As dawn approached, Captain Benteen rode over to where Major Reno was stationed. He requested reinforcements, fearing that the Indians would soon charge his position, and with only one troop, Troop H, holding the southern line, they were at risk of being overrun. Around the same time, a group of scouts who had been sent out earlier in the evening returned with troubling news. They had seen no sign of Custer's command, but the area was crawling with Indians. A trumpet call was sounded from a nearby rise in the hopes that Custer's men would hear and join us. The trumpeter gave several calls, the last of which was taps, the solemn melody often played after tattoo or at a soldier's burial. Whether by coincidence or some deeper meaning, the sound of taps echoed across the landscape, heavy with a sense of finality. That night, I stood picket duty with 6 other privates and a corporal. We posted ourselves about 300 yards in front of the barricade, each of us taking shifts to keep watch. The landscape was eerie in the moonlight, with low hills and tall sagebrush creating shadows that could easily be mistaken for approaching enemies. I did my best to memorize the features of the land before taking my rest, knowing that any false movement could bring disaster. During the night, the Indian camp below us was alive with the sounds of victory. Drums, shouts, and mournful cries filled the air. They had every reason to celebrate. Over 200 of our comrades lay dead on the battlefield, and their spoils were great. The Indians had seized our horses, saddles, blankets, weapons, and even money from the fallen soldiers. As the night wore on, we heard the sound of a bugle from the enemy's camp. At first, some of the men thought it was Custer's men signaling to us, but as the bugle notes became clearer, we realized that the tune was unfamiliar. It wasn't one of our army's calls. The bugle, we soon realized, had been taken from one of our dead troopers, and the Indians were now using it to mock us. Some speculated that one of the Indian scouts had learned to mimic our calls, while others believed that a captured bugler was being forced to play. Regardless, the eerie sound of the bugle, combined with the drums and howls from the Indian camp, added to the sense of foreboding that had settled over us. By the time dawn began to break, around 3 a.m., we were all on edge. The landscape was bathed in the faint light of morning, when, suddenly, 2 rifle shots rang out from the ridge ahead. It was the Indians' signal to attack. A hail of bullets followed, and we quickly withdrew to the safety of the barricades we had constructed the night before. The Indians pressed their attack, firing relentlessly from all sides. Exposing oneself above the barricade, even for a moment, was deadly, as the enemy was skilled in long-range fire. I noticed one of our officers, whose company was stationed in a more dangerous part of the field, sheltering behind our barricade. It was no safer there, but at least we had some protection. Captain Benteen's men, still without proper cover, suffered the worst. As the morning wore on, their casualties grew. Despite the danger, Benteen himself remained calm and collected, walking among his men as bullets flew around him. His bravery gave his men the courage to continue fighting. The makeshift barricades we had constructed during the night proved to be our salvation. The Indians attempted to charge our positions several times, but each time they were met with fierce resistance. Without those barricades, I have no doubt that we would have been overrun, just as Custer's men had been the previous day. The fighting continued into the afternoon with no sign of relief. We knew by now that Custer's battalion had been annihilated, but the full extent of the tragedy was still unknown to us. What we did know was that we were outnumbered and outgunned, and unless reinforcements arrived soon, we wouldn't last much longer. Finally, on the afternoon of June 26th, relief arrived. General Terry's column appeared on the horizon, bringing much-needed reinforcements and supplies. As Terry's men crossed the river and climbed the bluffs, the Indian forces began to withdraw. They had achieved their objective, and with Terry's fresh troops arriving, they knew they couldn't hold their position. For us, the sight of Terry's men was a welcome one. Exhausted, demoralized, and still reeling from the loss of so many comrades, we were finally safe. Historians have long debated the events of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and my account has been considered one of the key primary sources that shed light on what happened that day. While some reports of the battle were lost or altered over time, my first-hand testimony has remained a vital piece in the puzzle of understanding Custer's final moments and the soldiers' struggles. My writings have been referenced in countless historical studies, documentaries, and reconstructions of the battle. Through my eyes, future generations can gain a clearer picture of the bravery, mistakes, and tragedy that defined Custer's last stand. While historians continue to study and debate the events of that day, I am left with my own personal reflections, haunted by the memories of the comrades we lost and the horror that unfolded. The fear and desperation I felt on the battlefield were emotions I would never fully shake. Surviving such a brutal encounter left me with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. I wondered why I had been spared when so many others had perished. My thoughts often returned to Custer, and whether he had sensed his own impending doom in those final moments. The weight of the battle and the responsibility of being one of its few survivors has stayed with me every day since. The toll of the battle was staggering. Walking through the aftermath was a sobering experience. More than 250 soldiers from our regiment had been killed, including General Custer and his two brothers, Thomas and Boston. Their bodies, stripped and mutilated, lay scattered across the battlefield, a chilling reminder of the cost we had paid. The Indians had not only defended their lands, they had delivered one of the most crushing defeats in U.S. military history. In the days that followed, we descended from the bluffs to survey the aftermath of the battle. The battlefield was a grim sight. Bodies of our fallen comrades lay everywhere, many stripped of their uniforms and belongings. Among the dead were General Custer and his brothers, their bodies found near each other. The loss of life was immense, and the scale of the defeat was incomprehensible. The Indians had not only defended their lands, they had delivered one of the most crushing defeats in U.S. military history. For me, the Battle of the Little Bighorn would leave a lasting mark. The horrors I had witnessed, the loss of so many comrades, and the sheer brutality of the battle would haunt me for the rest of my life. But it was my story to tell, and I knew that future generations needed to understand the magnitude of what had occurred. My written account of the battle would later serve as a crucial primary source for historians, offering a first-hand perspective on one of the most infamous battles in American history. As I reflect on those harrowing days in June 1876, I can't help but think of the men who fell beside me, their lives cut short in defense of a cause they believed in. The Battle of the Little Bighorn remains a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict, and my account stands as a testament to the bravery, folly, and tragedy that unfolded on that battlefield. Though I survived, the memory of that day has never left me. The price we paid was steep, and the consequences of that defeat would echo through the history of the American West for years to come. Thank you for joining us for this incredible journey back to the Battle of Little Bighorn. We hope William Oliver Taylor's story gave you a new perspective on this tragic event. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with those who love history as much as you do. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll continue exploring history's untold stories.